Look around the table the next time you're sitting in a high-stakes room. Watch the subtle, invisible theater of it all. Someone makes a joke, and you can track exactly where the power lies by watching who laughs first and who laughs the loudest. Everyone in that room is broadcasting their rank, desperate to secure their place in the hierarchy. You see them adjusting their posture, softening their tone when the boss makes eye contact, dropping rehearsed corporate jargon to prove they belong in the inner circle. You've been there. You've probably played the part, nodding along to a flawed strategy just to survive the hour without a target on your back. But then, you notice the anomaly. One person sitting off to the side who isn't vibrating at the same frantic frequency. They aren't trying to dominate the physical space. They aren't shrinking into the background either. They are simply observing, and when they finally speak, they don't frame their statement as a delicate question to seek consensus. They don't pad their words with apologies. They state a cold, mechanical truth that instantly unravels the room's carefully constructed illusion. They don't care if it makes the air turn stale. They don't care if the senior partner frowns. In that split second, you realize they aren't playing the game. And because they aren't playing, they are the only person in the room who cannot be managed. Society usually slaps a polite label on this kind of anomaly. We call them self-taught. But we have completely sterilized that concept. We treat a self-taught mind like a quirky, harmless resume booster. We picture a hobbyist piecing together code from late-night forums, or a junior associate dropping a quote from Marcus Aurelius to sound deep over cocktails. That is a cheap caricature. The reality of this archetype is far colder and deeply unsettling to anyone who relies on a title to command respect. A genuinely self-taught individual isn't defined by the method they used to acquire their skills. They are defined by a severe, irreversible psychological mutation. They have been entirely stripped of the need for institutional permission. To understand why this is so dangerous, you have to look at how a normal professional is constructed. From kindergarten through the corporate ladder, you are conditioned to operate within a terrarium. The teacher sets the boundaries. The syllabus dictates what is true. The exam tells you what matters, and the diploma tells you that you are finally worthy. You are handed a map, and your only job is to walk the paved path without stepping on the grass. Because of this, your confidence is completely synthetic. It is rented from the institution. If the university revoked your degree tomorrow, or the company stripped your title and your corner office, your authority would vanish into thin air. You would be nothing but a naked person in a suit, terrified that you no longer have a piece of paper to prove you exist. The self-taught mind possesses no rented authority. They had to build their competence in the absolute dark. When they hit a wall, there was no professor there to curve the grade. When their theory collapsed, no academic advisor patted them on the back and told them their effort was still valid. The feedback loop they survived was brutal, mechanical, and entirely unsympathetic. The code broke. The business lost capital. The engine refused to turn over. To survive that unforgiving environment, they had to divorce their fragile ego from the process. They learned to consume failure, not as a devastating judgment of their character, but as raw, necessary data. The people at the top of the hierarchy do not know how to handle a mind calibrated this way. Power structures are explicitly designed to govern people who are starving for the rewards the structure hands out. The promotion, the exclusive access, the intoxicating feeling of being told you are special. The system relies on you having a price. The self-taught man is the only one who has already paid his. This is exactly why they make polite, credentialed society so incredibly nervous. When you interact with a traditional expert, you're essentially engaging in a hostage negotiation. You flatter their credentials, and in return, they bless your presence. There are clear, predictable handles to grab. You know exactly what they are terrified of losing, their reputation among their peers. But when you face someone whose entire cognitive architecture was forged outside the gates, those handles simply do not exist. You cannot threaten to ruin their reputation in a country club they never asked to join. You cannot intimidate them with complex theoretical jargon because they only respect physical utility, not fancy vocabulary. If what you are saying doesn't actually work in the real world, they will look at you with the blank, unblinking stare of a predator watching prey try to camouflage itself. They are a walking glitch in the social matrix, moving through rigid hierarchies with a terrifying frictionlessness. But this impenetrable psychological armor doesn't just spontaneously generate out of thin air. It is forged in a very specific, solitary environment that most people spend their entire lives desperately trying to avoid. That solitary environment isn't just a quiet place where new skills are acquired. It is the brutal forge where an entirely different cognitive architecture is constructed. Most people walk into adulthood inhabiting a pre-assembled mind. Their intellectual house was built by someone else. The university poured the concrete. The corporate training program framed the walls. Industry standard practices decided where the windows went. Because they did not build the structure themselves, they do not actually know where the load-bearing walls are. If a sudden crisis hits and the roof starts to cave in, they cannot fix it. They freeze, look around, and desperately wait for an authority figure to hand them a manual. They are tenants in their own intellect. The self-taught mind is not a tenant. They laid every single brick themselves, usually with bleeding hands. Because they sourced their own raw materials and tested the structural integrity of every idea through trial and error, they know exactly how the building holds up. This fundamental difference in architecture dictates everything about how these two types of people navigate conflict, risk, and power. If you want to see what happens when a custom-built mind collides with a pre-assembled hierarchy, look at the United States military in the 1960s. The Air Force was a monolithic bureaucracy obsessed with building massive, incredibly complex, expensive aircraft. The generals and the defense contractors, the credentialed experts of their day, believed that bigger, heavier, and more technologically cluttered meant better. They were designing flying luxury sedans and calling them fighter jets, strictly adhering to the bureaucratic doctrine they had all been taught to obey. Then came Colonel John Boyd. Boyd was a fighter pilot, not an academically pedigreed aeronautical engineer blessed by the defense establishment. But he recognized a lethal flaw in the system. The approved designs were going to get pilots killed in actual combat. To prove it, Boyd didn't ask for permission to take a course. He secretly taught himself advanced thermodynamics and calculus. He stole time on the military's multi-million-dollar mainframe computers in the dead of night. Working entirely outside the sanctioned channels, he developed the energy maneuverability theory, a pure, mathematically verifiable framework that proved exactly how and why the establishment's jets were sluggish death traps. Boyd and a small, rogue underground of like-minded strategists, famously known as the Fighter Mafia, relentlessly mocked the bloated bureaucratic designs. They ignored the right way to build an aircraft and focused entirely on the raw physics of aerial combat. They forced the bureaucracy to strip away the useless prestige features, ultimately birthing the F-16. It was a lightweight, highly maneuverable, lethal machine that became one of the most effective fighter jets in aviation history. Boyd did not rely on the institution's pre-packaged kit. He verified the truth himself against the unforgiving reality of combat physics, and in doing so, he humiliated a multi-billion-dollar military-industrial complex. This is exactly what makes the self-taught mind so terrifying to any established order. Credentialed minds are incredibly fragile because their entire sense of value is permanently tethered to the institution's approval. If the institution decides they are wrong, their identity shatters. They will actively choose a comfortable, approved failure over a messy, unapproved success. They would rather design a beautiful plane that crashes than an ugly one that dominates the sky, simply because the beautiful plane checks all the boxes on the rubric. The autonomous mind operates on a completely different metabolic rate. Their value is not tied to the warmth of the institution's smile. It is tied strictly to the cold reality of results. Does the theory hold? Does the code execute? Does the strategy generate leverage? If the answer is yes, they do not care if the method violates the polite norms of the industry. They do not care if the strategy offends the sensibilities of the senior management team. They bypass the emotional friction that paralyzes normal people. When you bring this kind of energy into a modern corporate boardroom, a university department, or even a complex family dynamic, the reaction is chemical. The people around you, the ones who have spent their entire lives perfectly memorizing the rules of the terrarium, will sense that you are entirely indifferent to the things that keep them awake at night. They will realize, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they cannot leverage your insecurities because you do not share their fear of being exiled. You know how to survive outside the gates because you built your foundation out there in the dark. Yet, this profound structural resilience creates an unavoidable friction. If this foundation is objectively stronger, and if the results it produces are undeniably superior, why is the immediate reaction of polite society not to embrace you, but to quietly attempt to destroy you? Polite society tries to destroy what it cannot control, and for years, you have likely mistaken their hostility for your own inadequacy. You thought you were failing the test, but you were actually just refusing to bow to the examiner. Think back to every time you have been subtly pushed to the margins. The meeting where you presented a solution so brutally efficient that it made the department head's 6-month roadmap look like a joke, only for the room to respond with cold, deafening silence. The social circle where you refused to nod along with the latest manufactured outrage and suddenly found yourself uninvited from the weekend plans. The times you were passed over for the promotion, the funding, or the partnership in favor of someone utterly mediocre, simply because they knew exactly how to perform the rituals of submission. For a long time, you probably internalized this friction as a personal failure. You carried your outsider status like a shameful secret, diagnosing yourself with imposter syndrome. You convinced yourself that if you just read a few more books, polished your presentation skills, or learned to speak their sterile corporate dialect a little more fluently, they would finally let you in. This is where the illusion must end. It is time to look in the mirror and face a very cold, uncomfortable reality. You have been playing the victim of a game you never actually had to play. You were secretly craving the warmth of the herd. You wanted the gatekeepers to look down from their polished towers, recognize your unorthodox brilliance, and hand you the keys to the kingdom. You were waiting for permission to be dangerous. And that lingering desperation for their approval is the exact psychological leash they still have around your neck. Gatekeepers do not exist to protect excellence. They exist to protect the institution from irrelevance. Their entire authority is an optical illusion that requires your participation to function. A gatekeeper has absolutely no power over a person who does not want to enter the gate. The moment you stand in the courtyard and beg for their validation, you are validating them. You are telling them that their artificial barriers matter. You are playing right into the central vulnerability of human nature, our desperate evolutionary need to not be cast out into the wilderness. But you already survived the wilderness. You built your mind out there in the dark. The hostility you sense from the credentialed class is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is the biological response of a fragile organism encountering an apex predator. When you walk into a boardroom, a negotiation, or a casual networking event, and you do not perform the expected dance of mutual validation, you disrupt their psychological equilibrium. They expect you to want something they can withhold: a title, an invitation, a nod of approval. When they realize you do not want it, their leverage evaporates. This dynamic extends far beyond the workplace. It infects modern social and romantic hierarchies completely. Watch how people construct their digital lives or behave on a first date. They curate a safe, heavily filtered version of themselves consisting of approved opinions, universally liked hobbies, and safe aesthetics. They are terrified of stating a raw, unvarnished preference because it might shrink their dating pool or offend a peripheral friend. They outsource their personality to the consensus of the group chat. If you have ever sat across the table from someone and realized they were just reciting a script of what they thought a modern, acceptable partner is supposed to sound like, you have witnessed the pre-assembled mind in action. When you refuse to play that game, when you state exactly what you want and who you are without any defensive padding, it shocks their system. They do not know how to categorize a person who isn't aggressively managing their own public relations. The system relies on you having a price. The self-taught man is the only one who has already paid his. Think about the physical behaviors you have used in the past when you were secretly hoping to be accepted. The long, rambling emails where you over-explained your reasoning just to prove you did the work. The nervous laughter you forced when a senior partner made a terrible joke. The way you softened your voice and ended your sentences with an upward inflection, turning a hard truth into a gentle question so you wouldn't offend the fragile egos in the room. Every single one of those micro-behaviors was a signal of submission. You were broadcasting your own insecurity, practically begging the institution to pat you on the head and tell you that you belonged. Your isolation was never a punishment. It was a quarantine. It kept you from being infected by the paralyzing mediocrity that happens when 50 people sit in a room and agree on a terrible idea just so everyone feels included. The lack of approval you have been agonizing over is actually the source of your absolute freedom. The second you realize that you do not need their validation to operate, the dynamic flips permanently. You stop walking into rooms hoping they will like you, and you start walking into rooms analyzing exactly where their weaknesses lie. You stop trying to convince them of your value and start letting the ruthless execution of your results crush their fragile theories. You move from defensive self-pity to offensive utilization of your autonomy. But recognizing this internal shift is merely the prerequisite. Once you stop trying to earn a seat at their table, the way you actually behave inside that room has to change completely. Recognizing your autonomy is the internal shift, but weaponizing it requires a complete overhaul of your physical and verbal behavior when you step back into their territory. You must strip away the frantic need to prove your intelligence and replace it with something far more intimidating, the strategic void. Most high-level environments are built entirely on the currency of rapid-fire bluffing. Watch a team of executives, academics, or agency directors operate. Their primary defense mechanism is continuous, suffocating noise. They build elaborate conversational fortresses out of industry jargon, acronyms, and theoretical frameworks. They talk fast, they dominate the airwaves, and they construct long, labyrinthine sentences. Why? Because continuous noise creates the illusion of unassailable competence. If they keep talking, no one has the time to pause, dissect the argument, and realize it is hollow. They rely on the fact that most people suffer from a crippling authority bias. The average person assumes that whoever possesses the most polished slide deck, the crispest suit, or the loudest tone must inherently know what they are doing. The masses outsource their truth-checking to the loudest voice in the room, nodding along furiously just to ensure they aren't exposed as the one person who doesn't get the joke. The self-taught mind possesses a lethal immunity to this theater. Because you spent years painstakingly breaking down complex systems on your own, failing in private until the gears finally clicked into place, you have developed a severe allergy to unverified claims. You view knowledge as a physical tool that must function under stress. They view knowledge as a designer jacket they wear to command respect. You do not feel the urge to nod and pretend you understand a flawed concept just to look like a team player. Instead, you weaponize your silence. Picture the mid-level director or the expensive external consultant pacing at the head of a conference table. They are pitching a new, aggressive reorganization strategy. They throw up a presentation filled with metrics that look sophisticated but signify absolutely nothing. Synergy, optimization, paradigm shifts. The rest of the table leans in, typing notes, terrified of looking out of the loop. You do not type, you just watch. You let the consultant finish their grand finale. And then, you let the silence hang in the air for 3 seconds longer than what is socially comfortable. Silence is a physical weight. Most people cannot endure more than 4 seconds of it before their ego rebels and they start babbling to fill the void. Let the hum of the projector suddenly seem incredibly loud. Watch the consultant shift their weight and clear their throat. They are waiting for the validation they usually receive. Instead, you ask a single, devastatingly simple question aimed directly at the physical mechanics of their plan. A cold, mechanical inquiry about ground-level execution that strips away their buzzwords. You do not raise your voice. You do not use their jargon to meet them halfway. You simply force them to explain the actual physical gears of their machine. Within 60 seconds, the stuttering begins. They will loop back to their buzzword, but the spell is broken. The entire room will suddenly realize the Emperor is entirely naked. You did not insult them. You did not attack them. You simply refused to adopt their unverified reality. This exact same tactic is equally lethal in the modern social arena. Go to any upscale lounge, dinner party, or first date and listen to the frantic exchange of rented opinions. People trade talking points they absorbed an hour earlier from a trending podcast or a viral social media thread. They state sweeping, rigid conclusions about economics, psychology, or relationships, waiting for you to either blindly agree and validate them or trigger a predictable, rehearsed debate. Do not give them either. When someone drops a heavy, borrowed opinion to sound sophisticated, do not reward them with a reaction. Hold eye contact, let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, and quietly ask, "Walk me through how you came to that conclusion." The panic is instantaneous, though they will try to hide it behind a nervous laugh. Their eyes will dart around the room as they scramble to recall the exact phrasing they heard someone else use. Because they haven't verified the belief themselves, they have no structural foundation to stand on. They only have familiarity dressed up as understanding. By simply withholding your reaction and forcing them to articulate their own causal chain, you instantly seize control of the interaction. You flip the dynamic from them lecturing you to them desperately trying to justify themselves to you. In a world where everyone bluffs to protect their fragile status, the person who refuses to speak until they know the truth becomes an immovable object. Your silence makes them deeply uncomfortable because it acts as a mirror, reflecting their own shallow understanding back at them. They are accustomed to dealing with peers who talk purely to relieve the anxiety of existing in the room. When you only speak to deliver verified facts, every single word you say carries 10 times the weight of their rehearsed monologues. You control the temporal pace of the room because you refuse to play their frantic game of intellectual ping-pong. This deliberate pacing and refusal to bow to empty authority gives you an incredible tactical advantage in the moment. But as the silence settles and the room realizes they cannot manipulate you, you stop being just an anomaly in the background. You become an active, breathing threat to the very foundation of their power. You become an active, breathing threat to the very foundation of their power. And history shows us exactly what an established hierarchy does the moment it identifies a threat it cannot predict or manage. It attempts to absorb it. They will not come at you with drawn swords or overt hostility. That is not how sophisticated systems operate. Instead, they will try to neutralize your autonomy by offering you a very comfortable cage. The moment the boardroom, the agency, or the social circle realizes that your silence is sharper than their noise, the entire dynamic will shift. Suddenly, you will be invited to the exclusive strategy dinners that you were previously locked out of. You will be offered a prestigious title, perhaps a new role with a beautiful office, but one that is deliberately bogged down in bureaucratic administration. The gatekeepers who previously ignored you will throw an arm around your shoulder, buy you a drink, and tell you that you are finally one of us. They do this not because they suddenly respect your genius, but because they are desperate to install a handle on you. If they can convince you to accept their hollow badges of honor, they can finally make you fear losing them. They want to manufacture a vulnerability where none currently exists. They understand that a feral animal is dangerous, but a fed animal that learns to love the cage can be controlled. This is the final and most insidious trap you will face on this path. It is relatively easy to be a rebel when the system is actively shutting you out, but it requires a terrifying, cold-blooded level of discipline to remain autonomous when the system is actively trying to buy your loyalty. You must remember the fundamental equation of this entire dynamic. The system relies on you having a price. The self-taught man is the only one who has already paid his. If you accept their currency of approval now, you're voluntarily walking right back into the terrarium. You're handing them the leash they have been begging you to wear, simply because the leather feels nice against your neck. This does not mean you have to retreat to a cabin in the mountains and live as a paranoid recluse. The most lethal players in this game do not wear their rebellion on their sleeves. You do not need to walk into the office tomorrow and dramatically quit your job, nor do you need to become aggressively contrarian in every social interaction just to prove you are free. That is the behavior of a teenager acting out against a strict parent. True autonomy is entirely invisible. You can wear the tailored suit, you can sit at the oak conference table, and you can smile politely at the networking event. You can play their game and efficiently extract the capital, the resources, and the leverage you need to advance your own verifiable goals. But you operate as a mercenary, not a disciple. A disciple bleeds for the corporate culture. A mercenary views the institution as a utility. You participate in the theater, but you never confuse the costume you are wearing for your actual skin. You maintain a core of absolute emotional detachment. When the company announces a meaningless pivot or the social group obsesses over a shallow drama, you observe it with the clinical curiosity of a biologist watching ants in a glass farm. You are in the room, but you are not of the room. Operating this way comes with a very specific, inescapable cost. You must make absolute peace with professional and psychological loneliness. When you no longer share the collective delusions of the herd, you permanently lose the intoxicating comfort of belonging. When everyone else is clinking glasses and cheering for a hollow victory, you will be the only one quietly calculating the structural flaws they are ignoring. You will not have traditional mentors guiding your hand, because institutions only mentor those they can mold into younger, compliant versions of themselves. You cannot be molded, which means you will walk the longest, most dangerous stretches of your path entirely alone in the dark. Most people simply do not have the stomach for this reality. They would rather trade their autonomy for the warm, comfortable anesthesia of being told they fit in. But if you can endure that cold isolation, you unlock a level of power that the credentialed masses can barely comprehend. Being highly dangerous in modern society has absolutely nothing to do with aggression, manipulation, or cruelty. It is simply the quiet, lethal refusal to be predicted. It is the ability to walk into a room of 50 people who are all subtly trying to manage each other's perceptions and remain entirely unmoved by their frantic theater. You cannot be blackmailed with social exile. You cannot be bought with cheap flattery. You cannot be terrified by the removal of a title. You are a closed circuit, running on a meticulously verified internal architecture that no one else has the code to. Tomorrow, when you step back into their world, Watch the game play out. Look closely at the strings attached to every compliment, every piece of corporate jargon, and every subtle pressure to conform. When they dangle a carrot of approval in front of you, do not get angry. Do not argue. Just look at the string. Let the silence hang. Verify the reality for yourself, and then act with the cold, frictionless precision of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. If you have the stomach to see human nature exactly as it is, without the feel-good illusions, hit subscribe. We have more to dissect.